Hello and welcome back. As promised, we're going to pick up and switch gears and start looking at 3D Studio Max Design 2012. If you're familiar with the program somewhat, you might want to skip this video. This is basically going to give a tour around the actual software, and we'll get into a few of the simple create commands just to give you an outlook of what we'll be covering over the next 7 weeks. It looks like I said, today we're going to cover the create move tool, just an introduction, basically, scale, mirror, the basic tools, layers, and units. The following week we'll start looking at walls and windows, AEC stuff. We'll be creating shapes. We'll be looking at the extrude modifier. We'll start looking at the modifier stack. And the following week we'll continue with AEC walls. Loft, we'll introduce maybe the loft tool. We'll look at importing AutoCAD and Revit files. And we'll look at creating cameras. The week after that, which looks like that's going to be about the weekend of March 29th, we'll look at lighting. We'll start adding lighting to our lights and lighting to our scenes, as well as shadows. And then at that time, we'll start talking about render settings. So we're not actually going to talk about rendering stuff until, like I said, the end of March. And the reason is I like to introduce 3D Studio Max in the stages of importance, meaning there's no sense in talking about lighting now if we can't model anything. And there's no point in talking about textures if we haven't talked about lighting. So obviously textures are going to be the first couple weeks of the first week of April. We'll talk about textures, color maps, bump maps, sub-object materials, multi-materials. We'll talk about advanced render settings. And the week after that will be the last week, and we'll talk about environments. We'll talk about creating walkthroughs, advanced render settings, some odds and ends, and some tips. Right off the bat, we're going to use, by default, we're going to use Mental Ray, simply because the school has Mental Ray. So, but there will be times that I'll refer to V-Ray for anybody out there who is also interested. So what I'll try and do when we get to the rendering portion of these tutorials, like I said, in a few weeks, I'll show a demonstration with Mental Ray, and then I'll also do the same exact demonstration with V-Ray settings. That way we can cover two different crowds that might be interested. I know V-Ray is what I like to use. So I want to make sure that everybody sees both sides of the story. So if you haven't opened up 3D Studio Max, or if you haven't downloaded it, and I did mention in the previous 7 videos that if you're a student, you can go to the Autodesk student community and download all the Autodesk software for free. Now, that only applies if you're a student. If you're not a student, obviously there's other ways to get a hold of the software, so I'll let you figure that out. But if you are a student in a university and you have an EDU address, visit Autodesk student community. And I'm not sure if the internet's kicking right now. Let's see. All right, so that's just going to be students.autodesk.com. And you would have to create an account if you haven't created an account. So probably the best way to do that would just be click on free software. And you can see here a list of all the free software. It's pretty impressive what Autodesk has done. I'll warn you though, if you plan on doing any freelance work or opening up any freelance work for anybody or in architecture firms, the second that you save anything in these student versions, a stamp will be placed on printouts. That's not necessarily true for 3D Studio Max. Anything that you render does not have a stamp, so that's definitely true for AutoCAD and Revit. Anything else, I either haven't. No, I know that Inventor also has a stamp, so you just have to experiment with whatever programs you're interested in. Here's the 3D Studio Max design, and you can see all about that. So basically, you need to create an account here. at Autodesk if you're a student, and log in and download the free software. And I think it's a perpetual license, or it ends every year. So I'm not sure if that would be perpetual or not. So anyway, if you remain a student, it's cool to check out. So once you are at this point, this is 3D Studio Max. So some people find it intimidating at first. I can promise you that right off the bat, we're going to eliminate half of what 3D Studio Max is. For instance, the only thing that we need to worry about is this area over here for now. Okay, everything in these menus up here can also be found over here. So it's kind of like AutoCAD, how they've spread things out. But in order to eliminate any confusion, for now we're just going to focus on this area. We're going to ignore pretty much everything up here. There's going to be some exceptions, but for the most part, everything that we need is over here. So right off the bat, you can cancel out all of the anxiety from the stuff up here and focus on this. We'll also focus on this area. This controls your view settings, viewport windows, zoom in, zoom out, perspective, pan, orbit, and so on and so forth. We're not going to worry about anything from this point over, simply because this all has to do with animation. And we're not going to look at animation, like I said, maybe until the end, even if that. If any animation that we need to worry about as interior designers or architects is going to be a walkthrough. And 3D Studio Max has been kind enough to offer walkthrough assistant. And like I said, we'll talk about that in the later weeks. We will, however, use this information here. This is your coordinate entry, kind of like in AutoCAD, how you can type in lengths and heights and so forth. We'll use that to type in our Cartesian coordinates and so forth. But we're not going to focus, like I said, on any of this stuff, so you can forget about this for now. All of this has to do with animation, so we're just going to focus on this toolbar that goes across the top. We're going to focus on all of this information and this little portion down here, and that'll be about it. So that should eliminate some confusion right off the bat. Now, kind of just starting across from the top here on the things that's going to be relevant. Actually, let's go ahead and let's look at the views first. I think that'll make more sense. Now, this is the main, this should be the view that you have when you open it up, the perspective view. And you can see there's 3 different options here for the viewport. What I like to do, and the way that I usually work, unless I'm working on a small screen and I need to see a bigger picture, you can come here. But usually, there we go. Wasn't going for some reason. Usually I like to split it up into 4 boxes, and the reason I like this is because, so you can see here, you have your top view, you have a left view, you have a perspective view, and you have a front view. So you have your orthographic views plus a perspective to work in. And just like any Windows software, you can drag these to make them the size that you like. Venturing into these options they might be named differently for individual things, but they all serve the same purpose. So we can pick either one of these. We'll go into the perspective here and look at some of the different things. So whenever we start talking about cameras, any camera that we created will be listed in here. So if we wanted to switch to a camera view, we could jump up here and select cameras. Any lights that we've created, these are your main views. Usually I like to keep them in this orientation. I like to at least keep one top, one left, and one front. For example, it would be pointless for me, well, it wouldn't necessarily be pointless. There will be times where you'll need a top and a bottom, but in general, it's kind of worthless to have a top and a bottom view, because if you're working in wireframe, you're pretty much looking at the same thing. But once you get into more complex models, it might be important to have a top and bottom view. But for the most part, like I said, I'll keep this as top, right, and front, or top, front, and right, whatever combination works for you. But it's important to realize that these can be changed by accident a lot too, and we'll see an instance of that. For example, I can pan here by holding in I'm holding in the roll on the roll bar, or the little roll button on the mouse. I'm holding that in and moving the mouse to pan. Um, if I hold Alt, if I hold down Alt and hold down the middle mouse button and move around, you can see I can orbit. And you can see the second that I orbit, I've changed this view type to orthographic. And sometimes students will get confused because they'll have something that looks like it's the top view, but you're not exactly at the top view. So you need to pay attention as you're working as to what this view actually says, and you can usually tell by the grid. So this is usually, you leave the perspective to look around in three-dimensional space. And the same deal here. I'm holding down Alt with the middle mouse button. If you don't have a mouse with a middle mouse button, did I just say middle mouse button? If you don't have a mouse with a middle roll button, you can use the orbit tool down here, same thing. So it's just a little more convenient to use a mouse, simply because while you're in the middle of working, you don't have to stop and enter a orbit command, and you hit escape to get out of it. But while you're working with the mouse, I can just click, I can zoom in and out, and I can pan. So it's helpful to get a mouse if you plan on doing a lot of this kind of stuff if you don't have a mouse. Same idea, field of view, pan, all this stuff is also here, but for the most part you can use your mouse. The view cubes, hot commodity. I never really like to use it. Actually, that's a lie. Recently, I've been using it a lot in Autodesk Inventor. I'm more of a SolidWorks person, but a job that I'm working on requires to use Inventor, and they're almost identical, but the view cube comes in handy in that. But because I like to keep these all the same view, there's no point in me changing the views here. But you can see by clicking on these buttons, you can go to different views. So this is obviously going to change my view up here, and I'm not a big fan of that. So if you like the view cube, keep it. But I like to have my views here. Okay, so the plus sign here basically has to do with viewport settings. We're not really going to focus too much on this right now. They're pretty self-explanatory. We'll take a look inside the viewport configuration here. Now these settings can be changed here. Same thing. So the rendering level, anytime that we need to change this, we'll change this out here. There might be times where we need to come in here and adjust the default lighting. Sometimes it might be hard to see because Max is by default shading a face that we need to see. So sometimes we might need to jump between 1 and 2 lights just to make it easier. Other than that, there's not a whole lot that we need to worry about. When we start creating cameras, we'll start talking about safe frames. Basically shows you what your margins are, what's going to be in your picture and what's not. You'll find that the renderings that you create aren't exactly the same proportion or size sometimes as the actual window here. So the safe frame eliminates any confusion there. If you don't want the view cube, this is where you turn it off. Usually you'll see me, I'll turn this off because I don't like it. I just like all the screen real estate that I can get. For the most part, that's all that we're gonna really, need to look at for the introduction of this. So, you feel free to take a look around here. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can let me know, and I'll answer them the best that I can. Some of the stuff is even beyond me when it comes to, the advanced renderings, animation and so forth. So, but I'd be happy to try and answer your questions. So, jumping out of here, I'll hit OK. And like I said before, we can control the type of view that we have with these boxes here. So, for example, I'll go ahead and drag a box out here now. Don't worry too much about creating this. I'm just doing it to prove a point. So you can see by default, my 3 orthographic views are wireframe, 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 and wireframe. This one is actually smooth and highlights. And actually what I like to do here, if I click on that, there's an option called Edged Faces. I usually like to have that on. And what that does is it shows me the edges of all my faces. And we'll see a difference with that in the future. But usually I like to keep that on. I can adjust this to wireframe if I want to. There will certainly be times where you'll need to do this. You'll need to jump back and forth. By no means will you keep it on the same thing all the time. So feel free to switch this as needed. Sometimes you'll need to see a line on the other side of it, or sometimes you'll just have a mess of objects and you'll need to switch. Same goes for here. Sometimes you want to see this as shaded and not wireframe. So feel free again to switch that when needed. One thing to point out here is this yellow box. That basically just represents that's the viewport that's active. So it changes as you click inside of these boxes. You can see that right now we are working unitless. So we're just at the grid is set to 10. Okay, that's just 10 units. So each one of those blocks is 10 units. We need to go to the customize to set up our units. And as architects or interior designers or interior architects, we're probably for the most part going to work US standard. And some of you might prefer working in metric, and that's totally fine. The default units, you can whatever basically if you like entering inches without putting in the inch mark, or for example in AutoCAD, if you just type 56 and you're working in inches, you don't need to put the double quotation mark there. You can just put 56 and enter, and it defaults to inches. So this is what this defaults to. Usually I work in inches for the most part. It's rare that I'll work totally in feet. So usually that'll stay at inches. And precision is good at a 32nd. But obviously if you want more, feel free to bump that up. System unit setup. This isn't something that you need to adjust often. You can see that if you wanted to alter what's going on here, you could alter the system unit setup. Again, this isn't something that we're going to worry about. The resulting accuracy here, as you can see, is to the nanoscale, it looks like. So that's totally fine. So for all intent purposes, when I do renderings, sometimes I don't even sometimes I don't do things so precise. I like to make it look right for the view and save time. So you'll get a little bit of that for me when I start showing you how to actually create renderings. So so now you can see that the grid is no longer just 10. Now each grid step's 10 inches. And back to the idea of being precise. I hate to say that Max isn't 100% precise. It is precise. It can be precise, but it's a pain to be precise in Max, and you'll find this out as we go along. So usually what I like to do, or what ends up happening, is I'll complete my Revit model with my sheets and everything, and I'll import 3D Revit model. And then when I import that, the units will import it in. So basically what that does two things. It gets a lot of work out of the way for you, for one. And for two, it gives you a sense of scale. So basically working from the size of your rooms, or working from the thickness of your walls, or whatever, that you can get your object close enough to where it looks right in a rendering. It might not actually be, it might be off a few inches here or there. And that should be fine for all intent purposes, because you're not going to use this, more than likely for this purpose, you're not going to use this to send to a 3D printer. You're not going to use this to build off of. The sole purpose of using Max as an interior designer or an architect for most points, or even an engineer, is to create a visual image that shows your design accurately. So if you can do that without being precise, then you mastered the idea of creating these models. So I don't want to say that you don't have to be precise. I'm just saying that if the client has the extra time and the money to give you to be precise, I would say go for it. Usually you don't have the luxury of that, so you need to make it look right and fast, for one, and be efficient with your time. So that's kind of the things that I'll be focusing on more so than being precise. So basically, if you follow these videos, that's my disclaimer, that sometimes I'll be cutting corners to make things look like they should be, but they're not necessarily. They might be off a couple inches here or a couple inches there. I don't really see the point in wasting time to make it 100% accurate if it's not necessary. So go ahead and catch up. We'll come back here in a second and continue on with introduction of the standard primitives. Okay, so as I said before, everything that we need to really worry about in 3D Studio Max, for the most part, is going to be right over here. And it's organized in a hierarchy that will allow you to step through these pretty easily. So you can see here we have a tab, that's the new tab. Okay, this is the Create tab. So if I hover over this for a second, it should give me a... All right, so it doesn't want to come out now. It looks like it's trying to there, but this is the Create tab here. So under the Create tab, we can create all of these different things. So we have Create, and then we have our geometry. We have shapes, lights, cameras, helpers, warps, and systems. We're not really going to worry about warps. We might use a little bit of helper, and we might use a system for daylight. But for the most part, your modeling stuff's going to come from these two here, geometry and shapes. So we have create new, geometry, standard primitives. So these are your basic building blocks. So you have your box, your sphere, your cylinder, and for whatever reason, the teapot always makes it into every version of Max. You have cone, geosphere, tube, and so on and so forth. So under standard primitives, we have all these other options. And like I said, next week we're going to start looking at AC standard, where we'll start talking about walls. And doors, obviously the big one, and windows. So, but for the most part, we'll be looking at standard and extended here between these two. Let's see, anything? We'll also talk about booleans. Actually, we'll actually focus more on pro booleans. It's a newer version. I'm not sure why they haven't axed boolean yet, but pro boolean seems to work better, and we can always go back with this. So, we'll definitely use pro boolean. So under the standard primitives here, it's pretty straightforward as far as creating this stuff. You can create it in any viewport you want to. For example, if I select box here, I just come out here and graphically click and hold. So I haven't let go of the mouse yet. I click and hold and let go and pull up. So it's length, width, height. And you could also enter that on the keyboard if you wanted to enter something and hit create, and it will drop it where you actually place it. So this is based off the Cartesian coordinate system. So if I move this with the move tool here, this would be the move tool, and you'll notice a transform comes up, a little gizmo here. And this is how you actually move things. Notice in each of these views, this gizmo changes, right? So I have X in this direction, but in the top view, Y is in this direction. But in the front view, X is in this direction and Z is in this direction. So depending on what view you have activated depends. And notice when I activate this, it switches to Y. So depending on what view you're actually in depends on what you're moving. So they're color coordinated. So once you get used to it a little more, you understand what's going on. But basically in AutoCAD, if you're familiar with AutoCAD, there's a thing called ortho, which allows you to move or draw things in 90-degree increments. There's nothing like that you actually physically turn on in 3D Studio Max. Basically how it's set up is if you select the move command, this gizmo, notice it highlights when I'm over the X, and it highlights when I'm over the Y, and it highlights when I'm over this. If I want it to move only in the X direction, I need to make sure I'm only over the X arrow. And if you move that back and forth, you'll notice that I am pretty much locked to that X axis. I'm not going anywhere. Same with the Y. If I want to only move in the Y direction, I select the Y. And if I want to move it, basically, if I want to move anywhere, I just select inside that box. And that'll allow me to move it freely from any axis. So Max's version of ortho is actually within this transform. So you need to make sure that it turns yellow, and that tells you that that axis is activated. And that will allow you to move that. So I'm just going to move this over out of the way for now. Move it back here. And I'm going to create another box, but this time I'm going to create this at 0, 0, 0. Okay, that's right here at the center. The dark lines represent 0, 0. So that'll drop that right there. And I could do a length of 12 inches, 12 inches, and 12 inches. And hit create, and that just drops that in there automatically. So I have a 12 inch by 12 inch by 12 inch box at 0, 0. So you can also do keyboard entry. Not something that I really ever do. This will actually probably be the last time that you see me use keyboard entry. Usually I will drag my my shape out here, for example, usually I'll pick a view for, let's do a top view this time. Okay, after you actually create a box, we can now jump over to the Modify tab. Okay, don't get stuck changing this. You can change it here, but sometimes this parameter automatically updates to something new, and you'll confuse yourself. So create the box, jump to the Modify tab, and you'll notice it's almost identical, right? So if we go back here, it's gone now, but you'll notice that this looks a lot like in the Modify tab, looks like this. So if I want to modify it after I create it, I can. So I can make that same box after it's already created by hitting 12, 12, 12. And there's that same 12. Now it's not at 0, 0. That's where the coordinate system comes in, and we'll look at that here in a little bit. So if you're not familiar, there's 3 more options here under the parameters for this box. So if you're not familiar with 3D modeling, everything's based off polygons, which are basically faces. So looking at this box, we have 6 sides, right? We have 4 sides and then a top and a bottom, so that's 6 sides. So when the computer, if I was to render this box, the computer has to calculate 4 different faces here. Not so bad. When we start talking about making smooth objects, we need to start adding more segments, obviously, because basically a circle, for example, is not necessarily a curved line. A circle, when you think in terms of 3D modeling, is a bunch of segments added together. Technically, just to prove this point here, I'm going to go to the shape, and I'm going to select circle, and I'm going to draw a circle here. I'm going to zoom in. Okay, so you can see the faceted edges there. So this isn't exactly a perfect circle. Circles are made from different line segments. The more segments, the smoother that you get. So technically, you can actually use a n-gon or a polygon, and I can achieve the same effect. So it might look rough there, but if I jump over to Modify and notice I can change my size of this polygon, I can boost this up to where about 32 usually. So that looks just like the circle, right? So technically you can create circles with a lot of sides on a polygon. That's the same idea. So the smoother that you want this object to be, I'm going to go ahead and make this bigger since we have that luxury. Remember I did that by hitting down here the maximize viewport, so that will switch whatever viewport's active to the full screen. So I have essentially created the 2 identical things, and sometimes if you're into CNC programming or anything like that, sometimes G-code might mess up if you create a circle, like say in Mastercam. So sometimes the only way out of that is to actually create a polygon with a lot of sides. Sometimes you'll, for whatever reason, run into errors. So the only downside to this is obviously the more sides we give this, the more the computer has to calculate. Now, if we're just dealing with 2 circles, that's not a big deal. If we're dealing with a complete site plan with 5 buildings or whatever, that's a big deal. So we want to keep this at a minimum. So things that are going to be off to a distance, sometimes we can go ahead and maybe drop this down to say 13 sides if it's going to be way out in the distance where we're not going to necessarily see it in that camera shot, or it's not necessarily important, but it's definitely going to be in a scene. This will free up a little bit of space, and a little bit of space goes a long way when we start adding a lot of objects. So how does this go? How does this tie into the box? Well, the box, like I said, has six sides, so 6 different faces. In the Modify here, we'll notice I can boost that up. I can dissect this box into as many segments that I want, but be forewarned that the more segments, the more times that you subdivide this box, the more times Max has to calculate each one of these vertices and each one of these faces. So you can get yourself in trouble quick. Not necessarily on a perfect square like this, but if we start adding modifiers to it, we'll get in trouble pretty fast. Okay, generate mapping coordinates is going to have to do with textures when we get to that point. Same with real world map size. So both of these we'll deal with in the future when we get to actually adding textures to objects. If you're not seeing these lines, these separations, Remember, I turned on edged faces here, and with that off, you can't see that. That's why I like to leave edged faces on, so I can actually see my subdivisions. So usually I keep that on pretty much all the time. Okay, so without it, you can't see it, and with it, you can see it again. And you can obviously see it on a wireframe. Okay, so for the box, that's pretty much all the parameters that you have. I'm going to delete these two circles here. I'm going to jump down to the next, back to the geometry tab, and I'm going to create a sphere. Okay, the sphere, same way. Obviously, the sphere has to be subdivided by default, or you wouldn't have a sphere. For example, if I drop this down, you end up with some kind of diamond shape. If I drop my segments down here. So you end up with a diamond from a sphere. So by using 4 segments on a sphere, you end up with a diamond, and those 4 segments are 1, 2, 3, 4. So the more that you add, the more Max has to calculate. But you know, you don't have to worry about it too much. I'm not saying that every sphere that you create looks like this. You know, I'm saying if maybe if this is in the distance that you weren't going to see it as much, yeah. But if it's going to be up close, you're going to want detail. Sometimes it might be. Notice if I click and hold, one cool thing about Max is you can click and hold on those arrows and do a roll, and it actually notice that the cursor will go up to the top of the screen and automatically come down. So I can keep going. So with big numbers, that helps a lot. So I can just hold down that button and move my mouse back and forth, and that'll roll through there. So you can see how smooth you can make it. It caps at 200, which is plenty smooth enough. Like if you were going to do something like super close shot here, like if this was if you were a product designer, for example, and you wanted it to be a nice close camera shot, and you really wanted that to be really smooth, you could boost this up to maybe the 90s. Usually, like I said, 32 is where I'll keep it by default. And if I know that it's going to be close, or I know there's going to be a shadow cast that might have some jagged edges, I might bump this up to like 45 or so. Usually won't go much higher than that because it's more segments that the computer actually has to calculate. So each one of these faces, you can consider a little bit of chunk of your processing and memory power. Okay, so that's what the segments is. The smooth does just as it says. It smooths out, pretty much finds the average between the 2 points and smooths that out so that it's nice and smooth. If you're creating a sphere, 9 times out of 10, this is going to be on smooth. Hemisphere, just as it says, if you want to cut this thing down, you can cut the sphere down right off the bat just in the basic parameters by using hemisphere, and that'll, just as it says, make a hemisphere. So that's kind of a shortcut to a modifier. There's other ways that we can achieve this in the future, so if you're not quite sure how your design is going to turn out, usually you won't add a hemisphere here. We'll see how we can modify that in the future. But just so you know that the option is available, and if you don't want it to chop, notice that it's chopping off pretty much the bottom of that sphere. You can also squash it. And a little bit of a difference, not necessarily anything that would be noticeable. So, and if you wanted to slice it, so we've did the hemisphere thing in this direction. If you wanted to slice like an angle, make like a pizza pie or whatever, slice a pizza, you could slice from and to here, and you can create little, like I said, a piece of, basically a sphere wedge there. So you can slice and dice this thing straight from the start as being a sphere. Same idea here. This stuff's going to come back into play when we do textures. So that is basically the parameters, even under the Modify tab here. Notice I didn't actually switch to Modify, so I should get slapped on the hand for that. But so under the Modify, same idea, same tools. If I go back to the new tab, you'll notice that's gone because I would have to actually create a new sphere. So to do any modification after the fact, like to do any modification to this box, you have to select the box, go to the Modification tab, which is the second tab over, and change your parameters here. Now, I've been skipping over this. This is probably, once we get into the modeling phase, this is by far the most important area in this entire program. This is known as the modifier stack. And, excuse me, basically, we've created a basic box here, and it even says box in the modifier stack. Now, I don't want to confuse you, and we're not really going to talk about modifiers until to the next video. I don't want to delve into that too much, but just to give you an idea of what's going on and where we're headed with this. If I drop down the modifier list, you're going to see a bunch of modifiers that we can add to this box. Okay, so there's tons and tons of things that we can do to it. For instance, if we wanted to twist this box, we could add a twist modifier. Okay, and once I add a twist modifier, you notice in the modifier stack, it's called a stack because it's almost like layers in Photoshop or layers in anything else. It's going to go on top of this box. And it's going to have a little plus sign and a little light bulb. The light bulb means turn it on or off, just like anything else. If I don't want to see the actual modification, I can turn it on and off. The gizmo and center we'll talk about in a second. So once I add this modifier to box, you'll see this orange box that comes around it. Okay, that is the gizmo. So the gizmo is the orange box. Finkel is Einhorn type of thing. So whenever we want to add this twist, I just increase this value to an angle, and you can add a bias if you want to. Notice that it biases to either the top or the bottom if you want the twist to be higher or lower. This twist thing is nice and neat and all. It's not something that's really practical. Sometimes you'll find a use for it, but sometimes you really won't. If you want to change the axis here, you can modify. You can really start to really do some abstract stuff here. Obviously, if you want an upper limit or a lower limit, you can experiment with that. Not necessarily important. The key thing that I wanted to show you here are these segments. And remember that we split this box up with these additional squares. If I take a step back, and that's another amazing thing about the modifier stack, I'm definitely going to make sure that you're always using modifier stack so we can go back. So if I take a step back and get rid of these segments that we added, notice that the twist doesn't really work now, right? Because it doesn't actually have segments to twist. It only has the vertices in the corners. So sometimes these modifiers, if you apply them to something, make sure you have enough segments for it to fill. You need to have extra segments for Max to calculate that twist. Without those extra segments, there's nothing to twist. So, and you can also notice how rugged it is. So if we boost this guy up to like 20 and 20 and 20, notice now how nice and smooth it is. So in order to make things smoother, it's going to cost more as far as render time and processing power, but you're going to just have to boost up the segments. So more segments makes, just think whenever you're modeling, more segments means smoother. And that's what you're basically looking at there. So if you want that to be nice and smooth, you're going to have to bump these up. So if we go back to the 5 that I had by default, you'll notice how choppy that and pointy that is. All right, so this is a big deal here, is understanding the concept of the length segments. We'll especially see that when we start adding other modifiers. So like I said, if I wanted to turn that modifier off, I can do that with the plus sign. Every modifier usually also has this gizmo here, and gizmos can be moved just like objects. So I'm going to turn that back on. I'm going to select the actual gizmo so that turns yellow, and I'm going to select my move tool. And I'm going to move it in the top view. You'll notice the changes over here. Notice that the center of my twist is moved when I move that gizmo. So if I want to adjust where that twist is happening, I can move the gizmo. Same with the center. The center is another different finer adjustment. But you kind of get the concept here with the gizmo. So always be aware when there's these plus signs that you have a gizmo here that you can move, and that'll especially be true when we start talking about UVW maps. You'll be able to place, if you have a brick texture and you want the brick to be aligned a certain way, you're going to move the gizmo. Same idea here, you're going to move the gizmo. So when you're done, you have to click that, and that'll get you out of the command. If you're done with the modifier, you don't want it anymore, you can hit this can button, that'll delete it, and you'll be back to your box. One last modifier, we'll look at a couple of different ones here while we're on the subject here. I think there's a melt in here. Melt's pretty cool. So it does just as it says, it melts your box, and you can go between the different viscosities here. of what actual material it is. So you can experiment with these modifiers. I would definitely recommend that you go through them and experiment with them just to get an idea of what they actually exist. Again, this has a gizmo and a center that I can move. Let's see. Tessellate's pretty cool. Oh, no, I lied. I was thinking lattice. I'm going to actually delete that. That's triangle or polygons. I'm just thinking lattice. So it's a little too big. There's a radius. So this has a lot of properties. So you can see there, by lowering that, I created almost like a silicon structure for some kind of MOSFET or something. So the radius I turned to 0 is the radius that connects these guys. This could be like 0.125. Nice and small, and you can see that connects those guys. However many sides you want on that. The material ID obviously has to do with materials, and we'll talk about that kind of stuff in the future. If you want it to be smooth, thin caps, a lot of this stuff is just click and see what it does. I definitely am not going to have the time to go through everything. In this introduction, I definitely want to get you interested in it, so I'm kind of taking the time. So in the future, I probably won't spend so much time on each little bit here. But I'm kind of trying to show you the capabilities in this first video of where we're headed. This changes the type of the joints here. So pretty cool stuff. Play with that. And the last but not least, the one that we'll use the most when we start modeling is the edit poly. And edit poly basically allows you to modify each one of the components of the box. And for this box, well, I'll go ahead and show you here. So I'm going to go down to my modifier and I'm going to do edit poly. Okay, it's important that you do it this way in the modifier stack opposed to right-clicking on the actual object and looking for edit poly and converting it to an edit. This really technically isn't the right way to go about it, because if you remember from the modifier stack, we can roll back or we can delete things if we want to. If we actually convert this to an editable poly, there's no going back unless we undo it. So we never really want to come here and convert this thing. We usually want to do an edit poly modifier, and that will allow us to get rid of it if we want to. But now that I've created this edit poly, there's a drop down here. Okay, each one of these is considered a sub-object. Okay, these are all considered sub-objects of the geometry. So the vertex represents all these little points where the segments meet. Okay, so there's a vertex here or here. Anywhere that a segment intersects with another one, you're going to have a vertex. The edge represents each individual segment. So each one of these segments is considered an edge. The border, actually we're not going to be able to find a border on here. Borders are more for different shapes. The polygon selects the face or the square. So it selects individual faces, which is outlined by the segments. And the element is the entire element. So those are considered the sub-objects of this, now what used to be a box. It's actually no longer a box once you add a poly modifier. Now it's just a poly. Okay, so, and the reason I want to show you this is because this is where the beauty of it comes in. This is where all the modeling comes in. This is where the hours go for people that like to model stuff. So, because basically you can modify each individual point of this box, whatever object that you want to. Okay, you can select these faces and delete them and get rid of them. You can add additional faces if you want to. You can basically manipulate this box in any way that you want to. You can add modifiers on top of modifiers. For example, I have this edit poly. I can add a mesh smooth on top of this. And you'll notice that gives it nice and smooth geometry there, and I can increase the amount of smoothness that I want. And then I can step back to my edit poly and keep working. So select 2 on my keyboard, actually 3. No? Should be 3. Maybe it's not selected. I'll turn this off. So I can turn that back on and I can modify this as I work with that actual modifier on. So with a smooth out modifier on, I can come in here and start deleting stuff as well. So again, we're not going to focus on this today in this video. I just kind of wanted to show you in case you want to be adventurous and you know, experiment with this. This is kind of where the modeling side of it's headed by creating our organic models through here. Okay, so I can delete these if I want to and step back. So if I would have converted that to an edit poly, I would have been stuck with that, but now I can delete this since we use a modifier stack. Alright, so let's take a break for a second and come back and we'll wrap things up for this video. Alright, so to wrap this up, I really just want to go across the rest of this toolbar and introduce some of these transformation tools and some of the other tools that are available. We've already looked at the move tool, and we know that the move tool gives us this this gizmo, and I should probably show you where that sometimes for whatever reason this by default doesn't show up. And I apologize that I didn't show this earlier if you were struggling with it. If you go to customize, preferences, gizmos, you know, sometimes for whatever reason this is checked off. So if this is off, then you need your gizmos. This is where you come when they turn off. So you come up to the gizmos tab and turn those on, and that'll allow that to be on. So sometimes if it's off, obviously it's a lot harder to move stuff because that gizmo is missing. So if it's missing like this, just go up to the preferences and turn that on. Alright, so jump over to the rotate. Now the rotate has a different gizmo. The rotate has the circles, and it's basically as simple as selecting the circle that you want to rotate. When you're in a top view like this, there really isn't, I'm going to undo that back 2 steps, there really isn't much to it. I guess if you were going to rotate in this view, you could see that these different things light up to rotate in different ways. So depending on where you're actually going to use the rotate tool, depends on what these actually mean. And obviously in these views it's pretty straightforward. You hover over it until it turns yellow and you click and hold and rotate. One thing I'll point out about this rotate is there is, if you notice when you rotate, there's not really any accuracy to that. So in order to get around that, I'm going to hit undo to get back so that I'm 90. There is an angle snap right here. And just like AutoCAD, if you right click on that, you'll get the settings. And you can see it's going to snap in 5-degree increments. So my angle snap is set to 5-degree increments. These other settings, you know, the percent snap is for the percent snap here. And these other snap things we'll look at here in a second. So the angle snap is in here if you want that to be even a degree or, you know, whatever. Degree is a little small, I think, maybe 10 degrees. Just hit enter and close that. And now you'll notice that those values are rotating in increments of 10 degrees. So if you need to rotate with precision, you use the angle snap here. Otherwise, you're kind of just rotating to no certain degree. So I definitely recommend that you use that. Okay, the next transformation tool is the scale. Anytime you see a little arrow in the lower right hand corner, that means you can click and hold and there's more options. So some of these have more options hidden in them. These are basically different types of scales. You have your uniform scale, non-uniform scale, and this scales in both directions. So this is, I can't remember what the name of this one is off the top of my head. Basically, you can see that it scales in individual directions. Or this scales by the corner. So if I wanted to scale this box uniform, I would select the middle triangle. And with the uniform scale, you see I can scale it that way. Control Z to undo. You can scale it that way. I can only scale it in that direction. You know, if you want it to be uniform, you get this middle triangle, and that'll scale it in all directions perfectly uniform. So you kind of just need to experiment with the gizmos. Notice each time we change the transform tool, the gizmo changes to a different gizmo. And these are things that kind of just take time to get used to. The reference coordinate system, once we start getting into different grids, once we get into more complex things, we can adjust, like similar to AutoCAD again, we can adjust our view. Keeping that on view 9 times out of 10 will be fine. So, but if we need to adjust the coordinate system, this is where we'll come to in the future. Pivot point center has to do with rotation and multiple objects. So, for example, if I rotate this object here, I rotate it on the center of that object. Here, it's because it's one object, again, it's going to rotate in the center. So if I go ahead and create another box here, all right, and I'm going to middle click inside of this so I don't get out of the command. I usually click with my middle mouse button when I switch windows. That way I don't lose whatever I have selected. If you select with the middle, with the left mouse button, this will deselect and you'll lose your selection, which in this case isn't a big deal, but once it gets more complicated, it's a good habit to click with your middle mouse button to switch your viewports. Notice that stays selected. So once I have this, I'm going to come down here and do extents, and that's going to zoom. Well, it's actually selected, so zoom that out so I can see both of these. Zoom this out, and I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to hold Control and select the other one. So it's a multi-select. It's with Control, and I'm going to select Rotate. And you'll notice the rotate is in the center of the objects. Okay, undo that, and I go to my point down here and switch this. You'll notice now that it rotates on the object's center, so I'm not actually rotating between. You can get a good idea with the red points show you where it's actually going to rotate from individually in the center point. So notice each box rotates by itself. If I want it to rotate between the two boxes, I select the one with the dot between, and that will rotate those both about a point. And this one, I guess, is kind of similar. It would depend on how many objects you have for that to kick in. Usually the only two that I really use or need to use are these two. So you can, interesting effects here, how that rotates the other one about its center as well. So you'll have to mess around with that some too. We're going to skip that. We're going to look at snaps. You'll notice that there's 3 different snaps here. So when you want to snap to something that's in 3 dimensions, for example, if I'm working 3D over here, I would want to use the 3D snap. If I'm working with something that's flat, like just a shape, remember those circles that I drew under shapes? If I had like just a line, I would want to use 2. Okay, 2 snaps to lines and shapes. Notice that snaps there. If I see that in the 3D view, you'll see that as well. See that snap over there. So that will snap to the 2D. Notice on a 3D object, it's only going to snap to the bottom. So 2 will only snap to anything that's on the plane. So anything that's resting on this XY plane will be affected by the 2 snap. Okay, so if I select a 2.5, it projects whatever I have to the plane. So it might show you that it's snapping here, but if I click and draw, you'll see it's actually only drawing on the plane. So the 2.5 projects from the 3D, from the top snap to the plane. So be very cautious when you're using this 2.5 if that's actually what you want to do. Again, because that's going to project through to the actual plane. That's not going to snap to the top of the box. And then the 3 will actually physically snap to the top of the box. So you can see there, it's actually snapping to the top of the box. So that's the difference between the 3, if you're interested. Again, if you right-click on this, you'll get your different settings. Not as many as AutoCAD has. I hope in the future they improve this some. But it's still, there's enough here to get you by. And we'll use a good amount of these as we go through these series of videos. There's the obvious edge and the grid points that are normal, and we'll see some of the other ones here. While we're in here, you also see that your grid settings are in here. So remember, this was set to 10 inches. If you wanted to adjust your grid, you could come here and adjust your grid and snap settings. And you can do that by right-clicking on any of these, and you'll be able to access this. And user grids, when we create our own, we'll get there in the future. But if you wanted to adjust this grid, you can do that here. Okay, shortcut, if you hit S, that will get you out of the in and out of the snap command. So notice I'm hitting S on my keyboard here, and I'm toggling between snaps. So when you're in the middle of doing stuff, it's usually quicker to hit S than to come up here and click. Also, if you're in the middle of snapping to something and you come up here, you'll lose your snap. It's not like AutoCAD. When you're in the middle of a command here, you can't come up here and push buttons, because remember, in Max, it takes up the whole screen and then it refreshes through the bottom. For example, if I hit my line tool here and turn on snap, if I come up here, you'll notice I'm still drawing. So if I try and click this, I'm actually just going to click a point on the line, and no matter how many times I come up here, I'm just going to click more and more points. So it's good to get used to it. Now I hit snap and that turns that off without actually having to click. So it's good to get used to that, because it's not necessarily, if you're really familiar with AutoCAD, it's gonna kind of throw a curveball where you can't be in a command and come up here and click on stuff. You have to learn the shortcuts, or set your own shortcuts, and that's a little more beyond what we're gonna do now. If I come up to custom user, all of these are the different commands. For example, we were just in the snap command. Find one. If I wanted to override that, I could come up here and actually, you might not be able to, well, you should be able to still override this. If I wanted to change the key, I can do that here. And then once I have all my things, I can hit right keyword chart, and that's going to that will export a keyword chart of everything that you need. So if you need to know what your shortcuts are, you can come up here and do that. Or you can, I'm sure if you go to help or Google, they're really good help up here, just like Autodesk. Autodesk has evolved their help a lot. So if you get stuck, just type something in here, and it'll find it for you. Oh, we skipped some of the stuff over here. I want to show you. This is your filter. Not necessarily important because we only have two things. But if I only wanted to select, we have geometry, which is 3-dimensional, and we have shapes, which are 2-dimensional. If I only wanted to select shapes, say I had a huge drawing, I could drag select my select tool first. I could drag a box around everything, and it would only select shapes. So if you have a mass amount of things, these filters will definitely come in handy for selecting things that you only need. So if I only want to select geometry, I can come through here and drag a box, and it'll only select geometry. It won't select shapes. Select by name comes in handy if you're good about naming your things. If you haven't noticed, hit cancel here. When you select these boxes, you have a name and color. So if this was something that actually had meaning, since the Aston Martin keeps popping up, let's say that this is a nice shiny Aston Martin sitting here. That's right. And if I go to select objects by name and make sure geometry is turned on, notice only lights are turned on. If I want geometry, you'll see that my objects are listed up here. It doesn't look right. I guess that's right. So, so if I wanted to select either one of these, notice Aston Martin selected now, but if I double click on box there, now box is selected. So again, when you have a ton of objects, obviously if you're good about keeping up and naming your objects as you go along, you can. Hertz's birthday, so we'll call this one Hertz. So if you're good about naming your objects, it'll be easy to decipher. I'm actually gonna go ahead and come out with it. I'm not good at all with naming my objects. Usually I'm creating stuff so fast that I don't have time to name it, unless I know it's gonna get messy, and then I'll try and force myself to be more organized. Usually pretty organized, but naming stuff can be a little tedious sometimes. But just to show you that if you change the name, it makes it easier to find it up here. And always remember that if it's not up here, it's just because that object isn't turned on. So there's that line under shapes. We don't have anything else drawn, so all of these are going to be off. In AutoCAD, you'll remember if you select something from right to left, it selects everything that the box touches, but if you select something from left to right, everything has to be inside of it. Max's version of this is this toolbar, so this will select anything that it touches. This has to select everything that's inside of it. So this will only select, notice it's touching the line, but it's not going to select it, okay, because it has to be inside of it. The picture shows you that, inside the box. This, it will select anything it touches. So the same selection, notice it selects the line this time. So this button has to do with your selection. This is really cool here. If you don't want to use a drag box like this, say you had some crazy shape that you needed to draw out, you can draw out a shape to select stuff here and weave in and out of stuff and make your selection that way. So you're not just stuck with a box like most programs. You can change your shapes for selection here. Okay, a couple more things here. The mirror tool. Yeah, we'll go ahead and do it now. Again, mirror axis. If you want to copy an instance and reference. The reason I said we'll do this, I wanted to do this later, is because we haven't really talked about the cloning yet. If I wanted to make a copy of this, just a basic copy, I could select copy and I could do an offset, in the Y direction here. And you'll notice that I'm moving my roller up there and it offsets it up in the Y direction. Okay, there's also an instance and there's a reference. If you want it to be a separate copy, you don't want it to be affected by the other things, you make a copy, just a plain old copy. If you want an instance of this box, an instance basically means if I make certain modifications to this box, they'll also show up in my copy. This is really good for when we start creating lights, so that we don't have to go around and change every single light. If we adjust one setting, it will change all of the settings. So instance links, I don't really want to say that it links it, it kind of links these two together in its own way. And the link can be released later if you want to. It's not a permanent thing, but it definitely can get you in trouble if you're not aware. So, and reference is similar to instance. It has its differences, and we'll go through this as we go along. Basically, the two that we're really going to use is copy and instance. And copy, like I said, is a complete separate entity, where instance kind of has a link with whatever you copy. So if you want it to just be a basic copy, you hit copy and hit OK, and that's how you would mirror those objects. If I hit my move tool and select an object and hold down Shift and move it, okay, it's going to give me a clone option too. So if I want to make a copy of something, I hold down Shift, and it gives me my same options here. So this time I'll make an instance. Okay, so I made an instance this time, and this was a copy. This is an instance. So if I make any changes to this, well, not necessarily. It has to be on the parameters, not necessarily a modification like that. If I make a change to the parameter, notice those are linked together. So whatever I change on this one, it changes on my copy. Not necessarily true for the copies that I made up here, because they're not linked, they're just instances. Alright, so that's the difference there. We'll come back to the Align tool. Layers is one thing I wanted to point out. This is similar to AutoCAD layers, and when you import AutoCAD layers, this is where we'll find all that information. You can create new layers if you want to. Just like you can anything else. Everything right now is on the 0 layer, the default layer. Create new layers by hitting the new layer tab there. Again, I'm not really going to touch on this too much. That's pretty straightforward stuff. And the rest of the stuff has to do with animation until we get to the material editor, which contains all of our materials. This is where we'll come here in a few weeks when we're ready to start putting paint on this stuff, or giving it glass, or whatever the case might be. We'll start applying materials to these objects. And the last three have to do with rendering. So when we come to actually render the stuff, we'll come here and render. And again, that's in a few weeks. I don't really want to press that on people right now. This is quite a bit to take in as it is. So I just want you to get your feet wet. And then again, the next week we'll start getting into more detail. Let's see, I cover everything that I should cover this time. Yeah, so that basically introduces the whole concept of max. Again, just to recap through here, I didn't focus a lot on the shapes. I did more of the geometry. So I have all of this different geometry that I can come out here. And remember, each thing has its properties. So it's endless on the amount of stuff that you can create out of these basic standard objects. And usually this is the starting grounds. Now, so you really just have to experiment with some of this stuff. And I can adjust the outer radius. I can adjust the inner radius of this tube. I can, it's like I said, the basics of it. It just takes experimentation as far as learning the basics of this stuff. Just allot yourself a half an hour to come in here and start dragging stuff. The worst that's going to happen is Max is going to crash and you're going to have to restart it. But you're just playing around, so feel free to crash Max as much as you want playing with some of these. And the reason I say you might crash it is because sometimes these segments can be touchy. If you boost something up too much and your computer doesn't want to handle that much at that time, sometimes it can bust and crash. No big deal, just restart it. Which brings a good point. Once we get going, we'll have to save often. Extended perimeters are just more advanced shapes instead of just your standard shapes. So it's just where's it at? There it is. L brackets. So your L brackets and the C bracket. So the stuff's already drawn out for you. Which is nice. Again, I'm not going to go through all this stuff, but you can see there's a lot of parameters for some of these. I didn't really cover over the shapes too much. We'll talk about that once we get going, but you have your basic line, which is how if you remember, I drew that shape. I did that with a line, your circle and arc, and those are the three that you'll use the most. You can basically do everything with a line and a circle, I guess, are the two that we'll use. And we'll use splines. We're not going to get into NURBS here. Everything that we do is going to be polygons and splines. Lights we weren't going to worry about this week. So, play around with these two here for next week. Just get familiar with transversing through here, these two tabs, the Modify tab and the Create tab, and then all of the sub-objects. And just get familiar with creating some of the stuff and get familiar with some of the properties. Get familiar with the viewports and being able to navigate through whether I want just one view here, if I want all my viewports, some of the zoom commands. Just familiarize, I guess, go through this stuff and familiarize yourself with some of this stuff. If you wanted different view sets, I guess there's other layouts here. I like the 4 layouts, but if you like these other layouts, you can come in here and change that. For example, 3 layouts on the side. I don't know how much use you can get. I'm looking on my tiny laptop monitor right now, and I can't see what's going on with that one, so not necessarily think that's a good one. The default one here, usually the one that I use, and sometimes I'll switch back and forth. So go ahead and play around with it, and I'll see you back here, not this weekend, but the next weekend, and we'll start actually creating some walls and some doors and some windows. So I will see you next week.